Tanoya. So something has happened this past week that hasn't really been sitting well with me, and I want to take a moment and address it here because it's a big, complicated, systemic issue that ties in environmental conservation, government, big business, and indigenous sovereignty, and I want to just briefly explain a few things to give you all a better idea of how totally cussed this entire consumer capitalist colonial system is here on Turtle Island, and what we all can do to act constructively for our collective futures. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm saying all of this as a white settler on traditional unceded Squamish territory, to whom I am forever grateful for the opportunity to reside here among the lands that they have lived on and cared for since time immemorial. Hoichoka. So the other day, John Horgan made a media appearance addressing saving old-growth forests here in BC, which is something that he promised to do well over a year ago and still hasn't done. And during that time, he patronized the 215 children whose remains were recently discovered on residential school grounds last week and used them as an excuse to continue dealing with the colonially established band councils as a way of continuing the resource extraction and division that has occurred on indigenous lands all across Turtle Island, and then claimed that by doing so, he was not acting as a colonialist, but instead towards reconciliation, which is just insane. I mean, especially because as he was speaking, the RCMP, an organization which was originally created to destroy indigenous opposition to colonial expansion across Canada, was actively raiding and arresting peaceful settler and indigenous land defenders at Fairy Creek without any media presence to witness, with no legal standing to do so, and all to allow industry into the forest. So as if the whole discovery of the remains wasn't horrible enough, he felt the need to politicize it on the first day of Indigenous Heritage Month, no less, in order to justify his shortcomings on the old growth protection that he built his election campaign on. Now, this is all just so incredibly insensitive, hypocritical, and offensive for a few reasons that really shows how broken our systems are. So let's get into it. The Indian Act of 1876 is what created reservations and outlined land that was titled to Indigenous nations all across Canada, and this is what forced these nations to abandon their traditional or hereditary governance and adapt band councils in the first place. So, for those unaware, a band council is an elected council for each Indigenous nation to which the rules for election terms and members were all outlined in the Indian Act, which was written by the nation of Canada, so that the Canadian government had a way of meeting with and striking deals with these nations that served their needs. So, in other words, it was the Canadian government's way of saying, yeah, we know we've taken over 90% of Indigenous land illegally now, but now we might finally treat you like fellow humans if you assimilate to our standards and do things our way so that we can legally do what we want with the rest of your land. So the Indian Act also created the legal title of Indian status for all Indigenous individuals, which formed the basis for forcefully removing over 150,000 children from their homes and sending them off to residential schools like the one John so emotionlessly referenced the other day. So while he condones, the colonial system that led to the residential school system, he approves of the colonial system that allows for third-party companies operating under Canadian law to make deals decimating Indigenous land for short-term economic greed, totally oblivious to the fact that all of this is part of the same colonial system. You can literally taste the medley of arrogance and hypocrisy in the air here, and it is sour. In today's world of politics and resource extraction, from old-growth forests to pipelines, band councils have often divided communities by pitting them against themselves over issues of economy that are pivotal to their quality of life. So on one hand, you have, elected council members who strike deals with parties like Teal Jones that allows their land to be logged for a nominal fee that benefits the community immediately, although no long-term commitment and with lasting devastation on their lands. Now, often these deals feature caveats that prevent the nation from criticizing or having any say of the methods of harvest used, meaning that they have no say in the manner that their land is treated, which not only goes directly against several articles of the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, a document that BC has officially adapted but not obviously implemented, but also articles of Canada's own Truth and Reconciliation Act. Then, on the other hand, you have hereditary members of the nation who often oppose these deals because of their short-sighted nature that doesn't secure any long-term benefit to the community economically and ecologically, that are often in opposition with traditional values and relationship to their lands. But really, no one side is wrong here, One is looking out for the long-term benefit of the community with respect to traditional values and ways of life, and the other is looking out for short-term benefits that can be created to add jobs now and improve lives today just to get by. So both have their merits, but ultimately it's this colonial system that we live in that is responsible for creating this divide in the first place, while benefiting through continued resource extraction and misuse of our collective natural systems. Now, as awful as all of this is, it is made even more so under the guise of reconciliation, because after decades and centuries of facing genocide, racism, and oppression that, whether or not you want to admit, is still actively happening today, you cannot come into communities like these and hand them a broken system that destroys the land they live on for short-term gain and call it a choice. Even with all of this in place, there are still cases today where a nation will ask, beg, and plead for the logging or development not to happen on their land, but they are simply ignored. So the entire system is just being used to further colonial gain over indigenous peoples. It's all just another ignorant, emotionless, colonial approach to working with indigenous nations on Western terms instead of honoring, acknowledging, and allowing these cultures to exist in their own unique, beautiful way. And when it comes to important issues today regarding resource extraction and environment, this dynamic only reinforces the need to dismantle these colonial systems and create one that works for all parties involved. The lack of adaptability or ability to see things a new way means that there are no options for different business models to arise that could actually achieve sustainability, because the entire system across all of Turtle Island is so far established that anything radically new, like ecoforestry, for example, would be incredibly difficult to implement. In previous videos, I frequently talk about forest industry reform and the need to return power and choice to small communities and indigenous nations who rely on these forests for their economic and ecological health by dismantling government regulations and monopolies, and this is merely an extension of that. The government's refusal to commit to an old-growth logging moratorium, to take the time to adequately assess and establish a comprehensive management reform, redistribution of rights and indigenous sovereignty, and instead continue to just talk and log as they always have, is not only a blatant disrespect for all parts of our society, our future generations, and the entire notion of reconciliation, but it shows their myopic commitment to short-term economic gains above all, and it is just sickening. The world we live in is always evolving, always changing, and we seem to always be playing catch-up. But if we can be proactive in that change, rather than complacent, demand more from our elected officials, and decolonize the systems that we operate in, we can create a world that better serves our communities, whether indigenous or settler, and the environments that we all share for generations to come. Not only do we need to continue to call on John Horgan, Jagmeet Singh, and members of our government to have them stand in their integrity and act as they say they're going to act, but as a society, we need to acknowledge that the system we live in is broken, that we are still very actively engaged in a chapter of history that enforces genocide, racism, and oppression on indigenous nations, and that all of this needs to stop immediately. I vow to continue to educate and spread awareness for these issues and to uplift, listen to, and amplify the voices of those around me, but it's important that we all take individual actions here that work for the collective good. We need to honor whose land we're on and their culture, empower indigenous voices to listen and learn from them, and stand for their sovereignty so that we can all move forward in this world together.